Hi. Today, I want to give you a really basic introduction to the philosopher of mind, Jerry Fodor, who passed away in 2017. Let me get right to my visual aids on that today. And I'm just going to take my time. I want to say that although he certainly does have a reputation as a difficult philosopher, I think a key to understanding him is to understand his rationalism, that he's a cognitivist. I say there on the slide, the apotheosis of cognitivism. Cognitivism, taken as far as it'll go. And so again, this video is for people who are interested in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and have heard about Jerry Fodor, but maybe just aren't exactly sure what it's all about or what it is that he's doing. And I'm going to try and explain that to you today. That's my goal. Just a simple introduction to Jerry Fodor, who's a difficult philosopher for sure. The apotheosis of cognitivism. So we'll have to talk about what cognitivism is. The basic issue here, I'll say, is about psychophysical laws. What are psychophysical laws? Those would be the bridge laws that would explain to us the connection between the physical structures and processes and properties happening in the nervous system and the mental experiences, cognitive processes, mental content, and so on that's happening with our psychological descriptions. So there's been a lot of debate. That first bullet point there, I mentioned the word naturalism. That's really a large debate, but I would say, let me read it out. If naturalism is right, naturalism just the idea that there's only one kind of stuff that exists. The natural universe is what exists. There must be a systematic relation between psychological descriptions and explanations and physical descriptions and explanations, some kind of systematic relationship. And Fodor isn't someone who actually believes that there are non-physical entities floating around in a literal way that, say, it sounds like Plato might think. We don't need to worry too much about naturalism. Let's, as I say in the parentheses there, if dualism is incorrect, okay, that's sort of the implication. So Fodor is wondering about these psychophysical laws. If you really want to know what it is that he's aiming at that's so interesting and makes him so important, it's that it looks like he has a promising take on maybe how to develop psychophysical laws, which is really, really interesting, considering that it's been thousands of years that we've been wondering about the relationship between the mind and the body. And I think that's what's impressive about his achievement. Okay, so second bullet point. Fodor sharpens the focus with his insistence on methodological solipsism. That's a big mouthful of a word, sounds like fancy words. That is, he only wants to think about events inside the body. He says solipsism because he's really only thinking about what's inside the head, if you will. One of his most important arguments is his opposition to holistic theories of meaning, holistic theories of reference, the claim that the meaning of any part of a language depends on the whole language, which of course is a contingent and unique language. I will explain that further to you and his reasons. In the end, if we understand what Fodor is up to, we can see that everything that he says really ties together. It's not just a bit of this and a bit of that. And seeing that, I think, is enough understanding of Fodor. As I say in the last bullet point there, I'm giving you a canonical Fodor. He was tremendously productive. He wrote an awful lot. A philosopher once remarked about the Fodor Book of the Month Club. And he is difficult, but this is, as I say, meant as a very basic introduction and what everybody thought was significant about his breakthrough book, which is The Language of Thought from 1975. And then there's The Modularity of Mind from 1983. And he made a sort of statement in The Elm and the Expert when he won a big prize in 1993. So anyway, the problem of semantic causation. 400 years ago, say in the 1600s, if you talked about the problem of mental causation, it would be what I think of as sort of the Casper the Friendly Ghost problem of mental causation. If Casper is a non-physical thing who just glides through physical objects like walls and doors, he doesn't have any mass or physical properties, then how is it that he can causally interact with the physical world? Again, 400 years ago, in the time of Descartes, that interaction problem was the essential problem of the mind-body problem, because it was conceived that the mind was a real thing that did not have physical properties, and maybe did have non-physical properties. And of course, when we explain physical causation, we do that in entirely physical terms. We call that the closed nature of causal explanation, of physical explanation. So that was the old problem. And nowadays, of course, most people, including people like Jerry Fodor, are going to say perfectly fairly that, well, they don't do ghosts and goblins and angels and demons, and they don't think that there are non-physical things around that are sort of doing things like that. However, there is still a cogent problem of mental causation. It's the problem of semantic causation. That is, it looks like if I say, let me step out of this to talk about this one just for a second. So say that they're in class and somebody gets up and leaves. And I say, why did he leave? And somebody says, because he was thirsty. And right there, we have sort of an intentional psychological explanation there. We can unpack that. What's being said is that he had a desire that he will go get a drink of water. He had a belief that the water fountain is down the hall. And those two propositions, the water fountain is down the hall and I need a drink of water, those two have a logical relationship with each other. The logical relationship is all the things being equal, then you will form an intention that I will go down the hall. So now say that, and that's what I wanted. That's the little mini intentional psychological explanation that I wanted when I say, how come he left? And you said, because he was thirsty, and that's it. You talked about his mental context. And that is what we do. Imagine if I said, how come he got up and left? And you said, well, there was an electrochemical event in his neocortex and it sent an electrical message down his spine, and that shocked the muscles and caused them to contract. And so then the bones swiveled on the joints. And, I think of that as sort of the Frankenstein's monster explanation, right? It's an explanation of how his body walked out, but it's not the explanation of why it is that he left. And so notice then, this is the problem of semantic causation, the new problem of mental causation. And that is that it appears that it's the semantic content, the meaning of the propositions that are the content of the intentional states, the beliefs and desires and intentions. It looks like it's the meaning of the words, the meaning of the phrase, the meaning of the sentence that is actually playing the causal role in the production of the behavior. And it doesn't look like the same thing could be said about these physiological events in the nervous system or in the body in general. Okay, so let's go back then to the screen. So as I said, second and third bullet point, just the presentation that I just gave you. We want why, the reasons, not the how, the physiology. And it doesn't look like the reasons are going to be things, at least it doesn't look at this point like the reasons are going to be things that we could read off of, say, electrochemical processes happening in the nervous system. Okay. Here's a little look, I'm giving you visual aids. Semantic causation, that is, you have two different causal processes going on, the one above and the one below. The one below is the neurophysiological causal process. And as I say there, notice it's a closed physical causal explanation. It doesn't have any references to any non-physical stuff. But there's going to be a story, a Frankenstein's monster story, about how this thing, these charged ions and these neurons led to these other charged ions over here or whatever. But then notice above, you've got the intentional causal story. That is, someone who with a belief that X and a desire for Y is all things going to equal, and in this example, form an intention to that Z. Okay. So that's the reason why it looks like you can't formulate the bridge laws in this case. The reason is that it looks like it's the semantic content, the meaning of the propositions, that's actually playing the causal role that we need to understand. So, all right, let's talk about what cognitivism is then. Cognitivism, the modern descendant of rationalism and Kantianism. Kant, just very briefly, said that in order to explain how it is that we can have experiences, we have to first explain how it is that the mind is organizing the sensory experiences. And so he came up with another version of rationalism, that there's sort of a pre-experiential conceptual structure to the mind, extremely influential to sort of modern representational theories of mind. You can't really understand Kant too well in all this discussion. He's real important. So cognitivism emphasizes innate structures of thought and realism about mental content. Since Fodor thinks that intentional states are people in relationships to mental representations inside their own bodies, then he's completely committed to intentional realism. Obviously, the view that mental representations are literally real things. I would say that's the main problem with any kind of any representational theory of mind. I think has, in my view, a rather insurmountable metaphysical problem with that. But another thing, so let me go on with that. Cognitivism, the modern descendant of rationalism and Kantianism, emphasizes innate structures of thought and realism about mental content, versus the more plastic evolving picture of mind among empiricists, including behaviorist approaches, or Wittgenstein's functional role semantics and so on, James's meaning as value, as utility. These are all attempts to get, among other things, to eliminate reference to mental representations and other kinds of inner states. So these divisions do descend directly from early modern debates in the 17th and 18th centuries. At one point, I would have told you that the rationalist empiricist distinction in early modern philosophy, the history of early modern philosophy, was kind of a hermeneutic for professors, but having gone over it many, many times, I'm certain that we still are in essentially the same argument that people were in really hundreds of years ago. Second bullet point. In the late 1950s, Noam Chomsky, a huge influence on Jerry Fodor. In the late 1950s, Noam Chomsky revolutionized linguistics. He was trying to criticize behaviorism. He thought behaviorism was threatening to our picture of human nature with his theory of generative grammar. Let me explain that one too. Generative grammar is a real important thing to understand. So if you think about most animals having maybe a range of calls, maybe they have 4 or 5 calls. Actually, nowadays we understand, ethologists have shown us that this is a lot more complex than we thought, of course, but excuse me. But anyway, your animal has a territory call, an alarm call, various calls like that. That it gives in appropriate circumstances. So you call that tropic. You can say that's kind of hardwired or genetic, if to use a popular term these days. But humans have grammar. The blank is blank, the blank. All those pronouns and adverbs, that grammatical structure. The cat is on the mat. The rocket is on the moon. The orange is on the menu. From this structure, because of the grammatical structure, what Chomsky pointed out is that humans can generate an indefinitely large number of propositions. Not only that, but since I can, with recursion, since I can say I'm thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about thinking, that shows, in fact, that human beings can potentially generate an infinite number of propositions with generative grammar. So generative grammar was Chomsky's sort of key move to show that human beings couldn't really come under these operational paradigms that behaviorists insisted. An odd consequence of the first half of the 20th century is that we came out of that period thinking that maybe animals did not have minds and humans did, something nobody really thought before the turn of the century. All right, so generative grammar. And then this is, again, and of course, that's an innate genetic endowment that human beings have, like birds get wings, humans grow language. This is Chomsky's kind of language. All right, so let me go back. And so syntax, grammar, just becomes a huge focus of linguistics after that. A modern linguistics is entirely really reflects this influence. So the last bullet point, the subsequent focus on syntax. So syntax meaning grammar. In linguistics, you have semantics and syntax. Semantics, a rather mysterious side having to do with the way that the symbols have meaning, or the way that language handles or generates or supports inferences about meaning. Semantics is a very difficult area. Syntax is about the grammar of language, the structure, the program, if you will. So that opened up then throughout the middle and second half of the 20th century, a big research area for cognitive linguistics, research psychologists, and research linguistics. Okay. Fodor's cognitivism. Now, I've been talking about the propositional attitude model of intentional states. That's a big mouthful too. Let me talk about that for just a second. Let me actually come out again just for a moment for the sake of clarity. So the idea of the propositional attitude model of intentional states. Let me break that down. What's an intentional state? An intentional state is a belief or a desire or a hope or a fear or a suspicion or an expectation or any state like that that involves content, right? A belief that something, a desire for something, a fear or a hope of something, you know. So those are the intentional states. What marks them as an intentional is that they involve mental content. What individuates each one from the other is the attitude towards the content. The attitudes are the beliefs. A belief is an attitude, a desire is an attitude, and so on. And then the content themselves. So sometimes you call it a that clause, a belief that, quote, the water fountain is down the hall, unquote, right? So you have two parts. You have the attitude, which is whether it's a belief or desire. It's basically an attitude towards whether it's true or not. And then the propositional content. So propositional attitudes, they're attitudes towards propositions. And this is really central to a great deal of cognitive science. This version of the representational theory of mind, you see it comes out of Chomsky and his focus on language and grammar. And Fodor is really the inventor of this. It's his article, Propositional Attitudes. This is the title of the article that really first lays all of this out. And to this day, the propositional attitude model of intentional states is really central to cognitive studies. So notice then that the way it works with Chomsky is, since the mental content is a sentence, it has to be that you have the ability, you have the grammatical ability to form sentences in order to have mental contents at all. So all right, there's a lot more to say about that, but let's get back to the presentation. There we go. Okay, so right, Fodor's cognitivism. So first point about what the propositional attitude model of intentional states is. Second bullet point, Fodor is a representational realist. Again, what does that mean? That means he insists that mental representations are ineliminable components of cognition. They're literally real. The reason that he thinks representations can be real is because he's got a kind of double aspect view like Spinoza, that there's two different ways of describing something. And let me explain that for you. He's a representational realist. He insists that mental representations are ineliminable components of cognition. That is ultimately a theory of cognition he thinks will refer to representational content, mental representations. I don't think that's true, but for just the basic metaphysical reasons. But again, he's got a strategy. Like the great rationalists Plato and Kant, Fodor conceives of the language of thought as common to all rational beings anywhere, right? Any rational being, no matter what planet they come from. Whether they might be beings made out of chemical mists or something, because cognition primarily involves, and this is Plato as well, cognition primarily involves grasping logical relations between propositions. Okay, it's these attitudes and relationships that we have with these propositions. And what are we doing? We're grasping the logical relations. There's a rationality assumption involved in intentional psychological explanation. When I said, how come he left the room? And you said, because he was thirsty. Both of us had a tacit presumption that both me, the other person, and the subject that we were talking about, that all three of us grasp the relationships, the logical relationships between the propositions. He needs water, the water's down the hall, right? Okay, so cognition primarily involves grasping logical relations between propositions, and logical entailments are necessary and universal. Okay, mathematical reasoning is necessary, universal, unchanging. Again, this is Plato. So it's important to see here that, like Plato and Kant, Fodor is really aiming at a description of cognition that's going to be universal. A version of cognitivism, an extreme version of it, is computationalism, which tries to characterize the brain as a computer. I have another video about that in the series. And so, all right, let's move on to the next. Fodor's functionalism. What is functionalism? That's another really important thing to understand. And let me just try and do it real quick. Multiple physical, first bullet point, if multiple physical systems, a human, an alien, a dolphin, a rational artifact, okay, if they can share the property of being rational, so you have an indefinitely large set of all physical rational beings. It may be that every rational being is a physical being of some kind, but because of the reason that I've just given, particularly about the difference between sort of the mathematics and the physical world, right, then you can't identify rationality with any particular physical structure. That is, to put it, I think, as precisely as possible, we don't have any physical criteria that we can use to define the extension of the set of all rational beings. I mean, essentially, that's the metaphysical problem of rationality, one that is very central, for example, to Kant. So last bullet point. Therefore, cognitive mechanisms must be described in functional terms, not physical terms. What does that mean? A functional description is, just as it suggests, a description in terms of function. So a description of a doorstop would be anything that holds open the door, which could, of course, be an old TV or me or a rock. A physical description of a doorstop is going to be something specific, one of those little brown wedgie things you get at Ferreteria Gonzalez or something like that. So supervenience is the term we use. It's I have another video. I have a video on supervenience and functionalism in this series. The idea is that you want a psychology that abstracts away from hardware entirely. It just gives you the cognitive specs. What is it that a rational being can do in terms of information processing and analysis? And as I say, functionalism, this doctrine that psychology is transcendental, since essentially psychology is a matter of grasping logical relationships, abstracts away from hardware. That's real important in the 20th century, because in the 20th century, people are building computers. And the idea is that people want to be able to instantiate the function in an artifact. So the designer gives you the specifications, and then the engineer gets that and can build it any way they want. So it's not coincidental that functionalism rose to be a basic approach to philosophy of mind and cognitive science in the 20th century, which was the computer age. Another thing that Fodor is famous for is modularity of mind. Let me explain that for you now. He's got to explain for the contingencies of the human body. Remember, he's a rationalist. He thinks that all rational minds are the same. They're transcendental. They are structured by logic and mathematics and not by contingent physical things. But after all, every individual rational being is a physical being of some kind or another. And they've got to put that together. There've got to be a lot of interaction between the CPU, if you will, this transcendental rational mind of his, and the contingent, imperfect, non-necessary body that we have. So the modules are the things that account for the things that are contingent and specific to my body. I've got to take the visual input and process that and give it to the mind. I've got to get, and all the other sensory inputs. I've got to comprehend and generate my own contingent human natural language. That's going to be another thing that's going to involve facets of my body that are contingent. I got to put together courses of action with my body too. And of course, that's the basic interaction with the CPU or transcendental mind. So this second bullet point, this is what Fodor means by modules. They're the lower level contingent mechanisms that enable the cognitive mind to live in that specific body. Why do they have to be modules? Because the only thing that can interact with itself is this rational mind. These modules are literally mindless. They don't grasp logical relations. They're more on the of the order of mechanisms. Third bullet point, in his transcendental rationalist picture of the mind, which is insistent that higher order cognitive processes are first just that, computational processes that must be understood as such, that is, independently of any specific hardware that is the contingent instantiation of it in one moment. And two, that this understanding will be entirely in transcendental functional terms. It's going to be a functional description, not a physical description of thought that motivated his late career criticisms of psychological explanations from evolutionary biology. Actually not as fine this moment, if you ask my opinion. But again, notice that evolutionary biology stresses selection over random variation. And it's this Platonism and Kantianism in Fodor that causes him to resist that, because he thinks that what we're really talking about is the ability to recognize mathematical relationships. Okay, this is really the crux of it then. If you want to see what it is about Fodor, what it was that he had for sale, as he would put it. Syntax as the bridge between semantic content and neurophysiology. So remember, syntax is grammar, the grammatical structure. Then the semantic content is the meaning of the proposition, that is the object of the attitude. And then the neurophysiology are these electrochemical processes that are happening inside the body, inside the nervous system and the brain. So syntax as the bridge, remember we want bridge laws that are going to hook up on the one hand, the mental content, and on the other hand, the physical states in the body. And he thinks that these the grammatical structure is something that can map onto some other kind of organizational structure in the brain, in the neural structure, right? And at the same time, he thinks that syntax can also capture meaning, in as much as he thinks that ultimately what the brain is doing is computing over symbols, over information. So first bullet point, in a computer, the machine language is the description of the representational content at the level of the physical state of the machine. So in a computer chip, you've got those little schematics, and remember how getting the computer chip smaller and smaller makes the computers more and more powerful. And the reason for that is it increases their capacity. Everything is just the capacity to do what? To have little gates where electrical impulses are either passing through or not passing through. That's the machine language. Say if it's not passing through, it's a 0, and if it is passing through, it's a 1. And as Leibniz noticed, working on semaphore code for the military in the 1600s, if you just use 0s and 1s, but you have enough 0s and 1s, you can actually represent anything. So binary code, digital code. Now, again, why am I talking about that? Because the digital code is the machine language. You're looking at both the coded meaning, the ones in the 0s are symbols that you can translate. But at the same time, it is also a description of the state, the actual conductive state inside the computer chips. That also is represented by the 0s and the 1s. I mentioned Spinoza before as having a double aspect theory. Everything he thought could come under both a physical description and a psychological description. And Fodor is, to very interesting effect, sort of going along those kinds of lines. So second bullet point, we know the machine language of the computers because we built them ourselves, so we know what that is. If there's a similar language of thought, so what is he after now? The machine language of the brain, of the nervous system, the machine language, the description that can be seen in two ways. can be read as a description of the physical state of the body, and can also be read as a symbolic rendering of the contents of the intentional states. That's the idea here. So we know the machine language of the computers because we built them ourselves. If there's a similar language of thought, Fodor reasoned it will be readable as digital code is readable in both ways, as a representation of content and simultaneously as a description of the physical process. So, so Fodor, last bullet point then on the slide, argued that's the grammatical structure of the representation that's going to map onto the physical state of the representing brain. Okay. Not a crystal clear theory, but you see the direction that he's going. Here's another one of my wonderful visual aids that I prepared for you. So schematic of syntactic physical identity. That is, the system here is both syntactical and it's a physical system, because what it is just, as you can see there, there's a sort of the thing sort of turning on its pivot there. On the one side, you've got physical things in the shapes that have the shapes of triangles and circles. But the mechanism that's moving has that triangular shape, so it's going to pick up the triangles when they happen to go into it and put them out on the other side. It's not going to do that with the circles. Okay, so that's the physical description. And you can see how physically it just is, it just, the triangles fit and the circles don't. So it sorts out the triangles from the circles. But then if the triangle also stands for yes, that is what we've said is, okay, the triangles mean yes, the circles mean no. All right, so that's the, so then that's the sort of syntactic or semantic content, right? So that's sort of the idea, that it's going to be like this, that there's going to be physical feature of the representation, because the representation is in fact some kind of process that's happening inside the body. So there's going to be a physical feature of the representation that's going to play this sort of physical causal role. And so again, it's a double aspect theory that way. Fodor's promiscuous innatedism. This is another sort of curious thing I want to explain. He admits that this is odd about his theory. First bullet point, Fodor suggests that while the brain can grasp novel concepts, for example, with new inventions, but since the environment doesn't significantly change the way the brain works, remember, he thinks everything, he's only interested in what's happening inside the head. It must be that all possible concepts are innately present as potentialities, like in the immune system. That is to say, as he admits, that cavemen had the concept of airplane. Second bullet point, that's probably not as fantastical as it sounds. Aristotle would quickly point out that we're talking about potentialities rather than states of affairs there. But it is the result of a hardcore innatism. You know, Fodor wants it all. He wants to say that nobody ever learns a new concept the way David Hume says we do, by forming an expectation about future events based on the regularities of our past experiences. He just doesn't think that's the way that it works at all. Last bullet point, echoing Kant, Fodor imagines the representative mind more like an antibody producing immune system, like it's got it all in there somehow, and it'll come out with it if it's given the right stimuli, pre-supplied with conceptual content, like the accumulated learning of a passive sensing machine, like the Humean or Lockean learning model. Fodor's eccentric writing style, this is the last slide, and then I'll be done. He has a very strange writing style. He writes sort of like, it's sort of like the Victorian children are lounging around the country house and their conservative auntie is trying to get them to do things, and she's just making them think about what's wrong with meaning holism and that kind of stuff. Very fey. And then he has a lot of Shakespearean quotations. He clearly good knowledge of Shakespeare. And it's odd, it's puckish. I can imagine someone being really irritated by it. I find him interesting enough that I don't really, at least I certainly don't mind it. It's self-indulgent, it's entertaining and different. It lightens up what are often very difficult arguments. That said, this is the second bullet point, it's also a bold self-affirmation, because as Fodor's work is undeniably vital enough that the community must read it no matter how he writes. Some reviewer I remember once said about him, he's just too good, so there's nothing we can just have to put up with that. And it's true. But last bullet point then, and this is the last thing I'll say, I'd go so far as to say that his prose is enough of a curiosity on a literary level to be of literary interest, but I also think it reads in an interesting way. And although the arguments are very difficult and you really have to bear down, I do find it rather compelling. And I think that his writing style sort of adds to that. And also, look, and I can tell you, I'm not Jerry Fodor, but I can tell you that the biggest breakthrough I ever made was when I finally realized that I had to write in my own voice. I had to write my own authentic voice. I couldn't keep trying to filter my thoughts through what I took to be some sort of more formally acceptable manner of speech. I just had to write it in my natural voice. And Fodor does that. Last thing I'll say there, I think it'll be interesting to see how this affects his reputation in the years ahead. But this is what he's up to. He's talking about syntax as a bridge between meaning and neurological processes, really. I don't see that, it's a research project. He doesn't have it concluded, but I think it's very pregnant with possibility. I have metaphysical differences with Fodor. I don't think that semantic properties are going to survive in a natural psychology. That's a huge issue, obviously, but my goal today was just to try to explain Fodor to you. Okay, so that being said or done, let's call it a day and go and check out some Jerry Fodor. It's a challenge. All right.